ladies and gentlemen, when I say I've known Mr. Magua from Boston days in 2004, so he's a very old friend. He had come to a workshop when I was at Harvard and Boston University, and we were doing performance contracting we did an international workshop, and I met Mr. Magua there. He was, at that point, looking after the state-owned enterprises in Kenya, in the government of Kenya. Now, of course, he is Director of Performance Management. His remit is much larger. He's the key person. He's the operational person on performance management and performance contracts. So he is not someone who is doing this as a job. I don't want to put him on the spot, but this is a passion. He has a long career devoted to performance management, and the number of cases that he has seen over the 16, 17 years would include almost everything. You will find that Kenya took performance management to grassroots level, and he will explain that story. It's a fascinating story, and I can say this with confidence. I should keep this story for after, but now that we are all friends, I can share. I was in the World Bank, and the World Bank did not think that Kenya was either capable or ready to do it. And when Kenya introduced this, within 2.5 or 3 years, they won the United Nations Award for Excellence in implementing this policy. So much for what outsiders think you're capable of doing and whether you're ready to do. This is common sense, because Kenya used a simple, commonsensical approach, did not, and again, not to take away from what Mr. Magua will say, he'll tell you the story, but since we have been discussing, it was again an act of leadership. They had a new president who came to power, Mr. Mbaki, and he was a professor of economics in the university, a very distinguished thinker. And because Kenya was going through economic doldrums, and he said, we are going to now, everybody will be accountable. And he introduced this policy, and the rest of the story, Mr. Magua will tell you more eloquently. So after this thing, please note down your questions. Unlike me, I'm always here and you can ask me later. But Mr. Magua has been very grateful to us for leaving his, stretched position, as Ms. Sandra Phillips was saying. You should see Mr. Magua, how stretched he is. But we are grateful that he has taken time to come and share this with us. And we consider him to be a partner, so we are thankful. Mr. Magua, the floor is yours, and you will make a presentation, then take question answer, right? You want uninterrupted right now presentation of your basic this thing, and then we'll open up the floor for question answer. That's what we will do, right?
Thank you,
Yeah.
Thank you, Prof.
Thank you,
and good evening. I think it's good morning in Barbados. So I think it's clear on the screen.
It is very clear. Thank you.
Very good. Very good. Delegates, before I share with you the Kenyan case, just allow me to give just a short geographical introduction of Kenya for the sake of those who may not be able to point Kenya on the world map. Kenya, whose capital city is Nairobi, is situated in East Africa. It borders Ethiopia and Sudan to the north, and Tanzania to the south, Uganda to the west, and the mighty Indian Ocean to the east. Coincidentally, Kenya lies on the equator, so we have a very good equatorial climate, both in terms of savanna, in terms of highlands, and we have a population of 47 million people as at the last census of 2019. We are a unitary republic with one national government led by a president, and the 47 county governments led by what we call governors, all elected by the people after every 5 general elections. Kenya also is home to the great 5 wild animals, as you know, the lions, the buffaloes, the elephants, and of course the leopards and the rhinos. Quite interesting also is that we also have the 8th wonder of the world. I don't know whether most of you know the 8th wonder of the world. This is the mighty wild beast migration that takes place annually between Tanzania and Kenya. So we are proud to be the host, the 8th wonder of the world. Good enough, that then gives you a good understanding of where we are in the world map. Allow me then, therefore, to then share the Kenyan case of government performance management, and again to really thank Prof for according us the opportunity to really share experience with Barbados, because this is part of what we are calling sharing the best practices. So I'll start off the presentation. You see on the screen the outline of the presentation. I'll give some little introduction, then the performance contracting cycle. I'll also share with you what I call the model performance contract. This is the tool that we use. So almost in the whole entire presentation, you will hear me mention performance contract. Then I'll also mention something about the performance, the broad performance criteria that we have adopted. I cannot miss also to share with you how we do the performance measurement. Then the linkage of performance management to planning. We have a very good linkage of performance management to planning, and of course even budgeting, and also the performance incentives and sanctions. I know Prof has mentioned about the international recognition. I'll mention it. The impact of performance contracting in terms of improving service delivery, because as it were, the essence of having any commitment for results framework is really to improve performance. And finally, I'll tie my presentation by sharing with you the current reforms that are taking place in terms of performance contracting in our country. So that is the brief outline of my presentation. So if I start with the introduction, back in 1990, the government of Kenya did approve introduction of performance contracts as a commitment for results framework. However, there was minimal uptake of the same in the public service. And I think later on I will mention something about this. But the reintroduction proper of what I would refer to as coordinated performance management, we trace it back to a very good planning blueprint that we call Economic Recovery Strategy for Wealth and Employment Creation. This ran from 2003 up to 2008. And when you make reference to this blueprint, one of the overarching reiteration in the document was adoption of results-based management, and consequently the need to place all holders of public offices on a performance contract. So we can therefore say that this blueprint is what gave birth to the present performance contracting that we have in Kenya. Before that, institutionalization of performance contracts in 2004, performance management was really based on what by now you know is ex post approach, and it was at really individual employee level. It had not been institutionalized at corporate level, so to speak, but it was merely at individual employee level. And the supervisors would therefore appraise the employees at the end of the year. If you ask me, this appraisal was subjective, because quite often than not, it was not based on any objectively agreed upon performance targets at the very beginning of the performance period. And therefore, there was no institutionalized performance management at institutional level before 2004. But after 2004, this is when performance contracts were introduced in the running of the public service. And since 2004, we have continuously, and I want to say continuously, because we are in the 17th cycle of implementation of performance contracting, of course, alongside other performance management initiatives or tools, but performance contract stands out as one successful tool that has endured the 17 years of continuous implementation. All ministries, including the highest office in land, this is State House, Office of the Deputy President, Office of the Attorney General, all state corporations and all tertiary institutions are placed on annual performance contracts every financial year. And these are cascaded to downstream institutions. So we have what we call first level, second level, third level, perhaps up to fourth level. Then we then cascade the performance contracting using other tools that I'm going to mention just shortly. So currently, if I take stock, we have 366 public institutions in the executive arm of government that have been placed on a performance contract. And the 366, as I've said, comprise mainstream ministries, state corporations, what in other countries are called state enterprises, and also tertiary institutions largely drawn from the Ministry of Education. Interestingly also, one of the second arm of government, that is judiciary, also is implementing performance management through performance contracting. I think this is their 8th or 7th year thereabout. So we have the second arm of government, that is judiciary, also on board. A number of constitutional commissions are also on performance contract. And here I would single out one of the largest constitutional commissions. This is the Teacher Service Commission that employs almost half of the entire public servants, is also on performance contract. They adopted performance contracts a few years ago, precisely about 8 years ago. So this is one of the commissions that we also use as a showcase that has implemented very successfully performance management. Now, I want to share with you what I refer to the performance contracting cycle, because of performance contracting in the public service, where we start and where we end. We normally start with the review of the performance contracting guidelines, And this we are doing in the next 1 week. We are starting this process. We normally start it around May, where we review the annual performance contracting guidelines, which forms the basis of the guide to development or identification of performance indicators as well as performance targets, which is this second box here. Then after that, we go through a process that we call negotiations of performance targets. The identified performance targets are subjected to what we call negotiations, really for the purpose of full ownership. After the negotiations, we go to another very, very important stage, what we call the vetting and the review of the performance contracts, to ensure that they are within the confines of the guidelines that will have been approved. Of course, after this, we have the signing of the performance contracts between the two parties, depending on what level they are in. If it is, for example, the first level, we have the president signing with a cabinet secretary, and then that is cascaded downwards. I'll mention this. Then after the signing, we leave the institutions to implement the performance contracts for the whole financial year, that is 12 months. But after 6 months, we do what is called media performance review. And the purpose of this is really to take stock of whether the institutions are on course or whether they are off course. A week ago, the cabinet secretary in charge of performance management, government performance management, did release the report of the media performance review, which our office prepared. And at the moment, this is being consumed by the various ministries, so that they can be able to see whether they were on track, and within the remaining period of time, what they need to do in order to really ensure that they achieve the agreed annual performance targets. At the end of the financial year, after the 12 months, we then do what is called annual performance evaluation. The institutions start by doing or undertaking what we call self-performance evaluation. Then that is subjected to an external team to do what is called moderation, to ensure that what has been reported as achievement is actually confirmed as much as practicable on the ground. And after that moderation, then we prepare a report, and that report has a ranking of performance of all the public institutions that will have been placed on a performance contract for that financial year. That then culminates into what we call the release of the performance evaluation results at a very high level by the president. And after that, then we start the cycle once more. The beauty of this cycle, especially the review of the performance contracting guidelines, is that it accords the performance contracting framework the possibility of refining it year in, year out, because it brings on board lessons learned, best practices, and therefore it is not, what we have in place is really not a static tool. It's a very dynamic tool which is able to accommodate lessons learned, as I said, and best practices as we implement the performance contracts. I've already mentioned this, that at the beginning of every financial year, each public institution formulates its performance targets for each performance indicator, but based on its strategic plan. And the strategic plan is normally 3 to 5 years. We normally recommend that should be based on 5 years, because in Kenya we also have what we call a Kenya Vision 2030 blueprint, planning blueprint, which has 5 years medium-term plans, and therefore it makes logic and sense that the strategic plan for each public institution should then also have the same timeline of 5 years. The performance indicators have also to be linked with the approved budget and also the annual work plan of that institution. Remembering that the strategic plan is 5 years. 5 years, you cannot fit a strategic plan of 5 years into 1 year performance contract. So you got then to dissect the 5 years plan into annual work plans. So the annual work plans therefore forms the basis of a very objective way of determining the key performance indicators and the performance targets thereof. After that, the draft performance contract for each MDA or public institution is then subjected to the negotiations. I mentioned this in the cycle that I showed you, the vetting and the review, purposely to ensure that it conforms to the performance contracting guidelines that would have been approved in respect of that financial year. The approved performance contract is then signed, and when I say approved, it is the office in charge of performance management. This is the office that I sit in, which does the final approval of the performance contract for each public institution. So you can therefore already see that this is an exercise that is done with a lot of meticulous approach, so that you ensure that what goes into the signed performance contract or the approved performance contract is something that is representative of the mandate of that institution, to ensure that the performance targets thereof are neither soft, neither are they hard. So it's a very meticulous exercise, and that is why, as I said earlier, we normally start the process slightly earlier, so that by the time we start the new financial year from 1st of July, then the approved performance contract for each public institution is a document that the signatories then are able to sign with a lot of confidence. The achievements are then monitored through what we call quarterly performance reporting, and the annual performance evaluation then is undertaken at the end of the financial year. We are just finishing making feedback of third quarter performance reports that were submitted after the close of the third quarter, that was in March. So we normally give ourselves 15 days after the close of the quarter and after submission to then analyze those reports and then provide feedback back to those institutions, so that then everyone is looped into the performance management in terms of also knowing whether the institutions are on course to achieving their annual performance targets. And it also serves the purpose of knowing in advance whether there are certain challenges that are affecting implementation of those performance targets, so that then you don't have to wait until the very end of the financial year to then say, this is what affected my performance contract. You are able to isolate those challenges well in advance and put in appropriate measures and strategies to ensure that at the end of the financial year, you are able to achieve the agreed performance targets. Of course, as I've said, at the end of the year, we do what is called annual performance evaluation for all those institutions on performance contract. Now, at the first level, the president signs the performance contract with each of the cabinet secretaries, and then the cabinet secretaries sign with the principal secretaries. The principal secretaries then sign with the heads of departments. This is what we call first level, second level, and perhaps up to third level. In the case of state corporations, the respective cabinet secretary in charge of that state corporation signs the performance contract with the chairperson of the board of directors of that state corporation, together with one independent board member, after which again the performance contract is countersigned by the cabinet secretary responsible for finance, followed by cascading to management. Somebody would ask the question, why countersigning by the cabinet secretary? The logic behind this is that state enterprises or public enterprises really are there, they exist to serve very specified functions and mandates on behalf of government. And therefore in Kenya, they have an aspect of reporting to the cabinet secretary in charge of finance. And this is why, therefore, the cabinet secretary in charge of finance has to countersign the performance contracts for all the state enterprises. The same scenario prevails also for tertiary institutions. These are tertiary institutions largely in the Ministry of Education. Currently, we have about 119. The cabinet secretary responsible for education signs the performance contract with the chairperson of the board of governors of that tertiary institution, after which that performance contract is then cascaded to management. So you can see the scenario is that we have what we call the first level, second level, then a third level. Then after that, we don't really deploy performance contracts, but we deploy other simpler tools, which I'm just going to mention shortly. This is the model performance contract that I want to share with you. How does it look like? Because I've mentioned that in Kenya, our commitment for results framework is the performance contract. So how does it look like? Just at a glance, we have what we call the preamble part. The preamble part signifies the parties to the performance contract, who is the principal and who is the agent, that principal-agent relationship. And then part one is statement of responsibility. The statement of responsibility is really a reaffirmation and commitment to performance. And this statement of responsibility is the section that also every public institution or the signatory to the performance contract is able to really bring out very clearly in very clear terms, very precise terms, what is the mandate of your institution. Because if you don't understand the mandate of your institution, even if you start crafting and developing your KPIs and your performance targets, somehow it never works. So you have to start by, first of all, internalizing your mandate so that then it is clear to you. Part two is the vision statement, the mission statement, and strategic objectives. Now, I mentioned earlier that the 1 year performance contract is based on the annual work plan. And that annual work plan is also based on the 5-year strategic plan. So if an institution has done a very good strategic plan, then the vision statement, the mission statement, and the strategic objectives are already in that strategic plan. So it's a question of lifting and then putting it in the standard performance contract. Part 3 is statement of strategic intent. Again, this is one of the improvements that over time we have done to the performance contract. Statement of strategic intent really specifies the priority areas for that one financial year, because you cannot do everything, for example, at a go. And this is the beauty of also linking the performance contract with the strategic plan, which I said is 5 years. So if it is the current financial year, then that institution that has prepared its performance contract must show in very clear terms that this year, in terms of my strategic plan, this is what I envisioned or I targeted to achieve. So therefore, you prioritize your KPIs and again link them to the budget. Part 4 is commitments and obligations of government. Institutions may require certain commitments and obligations from government. But the catch here is that these commitments and obligations should really be facilitative in nature. You don't want to tie government in terms of performance. And because if you do that and you are not very careful about that, at the end of the day, the blame game starts and you start giving yourselves excuses that, look, government did not do its part, and that is why I was not able to achieve my part of the bargain. So normally these are facilitative in nature. Part 5 is the reporting requirements, the quarterly reports that I've just mentioned, and the annual performance reports. And part 6 is the duration of the performance contract. Its standard is 1 year from 1st of July to 30th of June of the following year. But in our case, we have a few state enterprises whose financial year does not fit within that. Just a few, about 3 of them. And that is why we make provision for this section of duration of the performance contract. Lastly, we have part 7. Part 7 is the signatory to the performance contract. This is again a reaffirmation that what you have put in the performance contract, the performance targets you have agreed upon, is a reaffirmation that you are committed to achieve them by the end of the financial year. So at a glance, that forms the model performance contract that we have in Kenya. Let me now mention further about broad performance criteria that we employ in our performance contract. We have 7 of them, very broad, which then form the basis of the performance indicators under each of them. And these broad 7 performance criteria are financial stewardship and discipline, for the purpose of the financial aspects of financial performance indicators. We have what we call the service delivery, and I want to link this service delivery to what we call customer focus, because at the end of the day, your commitment for results must have a bias on the customers. If you miss that point and you look inwards in terms of your commitment for results framework, then you really are not focused to public service delivery. So service delivery performance criteria is more outward looking because it brings on board the elements and the issues of the customers or the citizens. Then we have the core mandate, or what we call operations. This normally is the core. Actually, it carries the highest weight in terms of the allocation of the weight in the entire performance contract. We have then the other one we call implementation of presidential directives, access to government procurement opportunities, promotion of local content in procurement, and then finally what we call cross-cutting, or in other terms, they are called dynamic or qualitative. Now, these 2, access to government procurement opportunities and the promotion of local content in procurement, are really what we call empowerment programs. Empowerment programs for government that then are brought on board the performance contract for the purpose of seamless implementation by all the public institutions placed on performance contract. Now, let me now go to performance measurement, and this includes monitoring, reporting, and annual evaluation. Performance measurement, of course, is undertaken to ascertain whether the planned goals, objectives, and the performance targets are met within the agreed timelines and budget ceilings. In our case, within the 1 year or 12 months. Monitoring, on the other hand, and the reporting thereof is undertaken on quarterly basis. Every 3 months, institutions have to prepare quarterly reports, submit them to the relevant institutions, and then those institutions analyzes them, and provides feedbacks back to those institutions. At the individual level, and I said I'll mention this at this point, we have what we call performance appraisal. Though undertaken half yearly, This is a continuous undertaking because of the nature of the day-to-day interactions between the employee and the supervisor. So allow me at this point, therefore, to mention that performance contracts, we use them at the first level, second level, third and fourth level there. But onwards, we don't deploy performance contracts to all the employees. And the simple reasoning here is, if you are to go that route, then in terms of human resources, in terms of financial resources, you would require massive resources to be able to do that. And if you are also not very careful, fatigue then sets in very, 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 very easily. So that is why after the fourth level of performance contracts, we use simpler tools for individual performance, what we call performance appraisal for employees. So the annual performance evaluation is undertaken for public institutions, and this is based on what we call composite scoring. And this composite scoring is really an amalgamation of the entire performance of an institution based on all the KPIs, based on all the performance targets. I would want to compare this, for example, to the final grades that we all get from either formal schooling. When you go through the formal schooling, for example, university, your final grade is really what you either call first class or second class upper division, or second class or lower division in our case. So it's an amalgamation of all your performances right from your first year in university, second year, all the way to third or fourth year. So in the same scenario, that the composite scoring is the amalgamation of the performance, the entire performance of that institution as agreed from at the beginning of the financial year. And in this respect, that performance scoring will either have excellent performance grade, very good, good, fair, or either poor. And this evaluation is done by an external team from the office in charge of performance contracting. This is the office where I sit. A report prepared thereof and then submitted to cabinet for further action and of course release by the president. In the case of evaluation of individual employee performance, the supervisor praises the employee in a one-on-one setup, and an annual report is made on the same, and that report finds its way into the employee's file because it becomes an accountable document. It becomes the basis for either promotions and so forth. Now, this is the linkage that I said I'll share with you earlier, the linkage of performance management to planning, because you can't possibly divorce performance management from the overall planning function. So in our case, we have what I referred earlier to as the Kenya Vision 2030, is a 30-year planning blueprint, which is broken into 5 years medium-term plans. Currently, we are in the third medium-term plan, running from 2018 up to 2022. Then from this 5-year medium-term plan, as I said, is then each institution then is able to develop a strategic plan again 5 years and break it into one annual work plans of 1 year each. So from here, this becomes now a very good basis because it's very specific. And here you are able now to start now seeing the entire performance management perspective in a much, much simpler manner than at this stage. Because at this stage, at the national planning blueprint, it is so general. You are not very careful, you get lost within this stage. But at this stage, it is so specific that you are able now to bring out your performance contract, you are able to bring out your staff performance appraisal and other performance management tools that are much, much simpler to deploy to either institutional level or individual employee level. And within all these, there is also an element of linkage with the budget. You cannot divorce again the budgeting function from this planning function. Now, what about performance incentives and sanctions? This, in our case, we consider as one key subsystem of a standard performance management system, and therefore is a fundamental component of our performance contracting tool. And within this, we have in place what we call a performance rewards and sanctions framework for the public service that was published back in 2016 to guide public institutions in as far as performance rewards and sanctions are concerned. And this framework stipulates both non-monetary and monetary performance incentives. But in our case, with the bias on non-monetary incentives, such as certificates of excellence, which are conferred by the president, and what we call rotating presidential trophies. Very simple incentives, if you are to ask me. And there's a very good reason why in Kenya we have not really ran very fast into monetary incentives, because you got to be very, very careful with the monetary incentives because of the sustainability aspect. If you are not very, very careful, your employees will keep on demanding the monetary incentives to an extent that at one time they become meaningless. So we in our case we have more emphasis on the non-monetary. Never mind that there is a provision for monetary, because we have, for example, state corporations that have bonus schemes. But the bottom line of all this, whether is the non-monetary incentives that are deployed or the monetary incentives that are deployed, the bottom line is that it must be based on the annual performance evaluation report for each institution. What do I mean? What I mean is that for an institution, for example, to be considered for bonus. Let me take, for example, a state corporation, because state corporations are largely the ones that have bonus schemes. They have to write to us so that we confirm that indeed their performance warrants or is in the range that warrants payment of bonus. So once we confirm that, then the board of directors and the parent minister of that ministry and the national treasury, once they all confirm, then that becomes now a basis of now payment of such bonus schemes. So I needed to emphasize that that the incentives, whether monetary or non-monetary, should actually be tied to objective assessment of performance as dictated by the agreed performance targets at the beginning of the financial year. Of course, this framework that I've referred to here also has sanctions. It has also elements of sanctions, which public institutions are able to be guided which kind of sanctions to deploy, again based on performance. Yes, I recall Prof mentioned about recognition, international recognition. Yes, the successful adoption and implementation of performance contracting in the public service in Kenya was recognized internationally in 2007 when Kenya was conferred the prestigious UN Public Service Award in the category of improved transparency, accountability, and responsiveness in the public sector. And this really gave a lot of impetus in the entire public service, because we recognized then that if Kenya can be recognized internationally because of this, then we needed then to advance this commitment for resource framework to a higher level. And indeed, that is what we have done almost every year within the last 17 years. Of course, other African countries have continued to benchmark on the Kenyan model of performance contracting. Just to name a few, we have Namibia, we have Sierra Leone, we have Malawi, Nigeria, Lesotho, and Botswana. What they have done is that when they benchmark with our model, then they go back, and depending on their circumstances, they are then able to customize to their needs and to their public, to the nature and structure of their public service. Now, what has been the impact of performance contracting? I've just picked a few because sometimes we like demonstrating this by sometimes picking a case by case, which brings out this very well. But for now, I'll just mention just a few. And one of them is the improved efficiency in service delivery to the public by ensuring that holders of public office are held accountable for results. Because the moment you sign that performance contract, really, this is an accountability framework. So you are really showing that you are accountable to the public. And for you to be accountable to the public, the other dictate is that you must then be able to deliver what you have committed to deliver. The other one is ability to objectively measure and evaluate performance. This one I've mentioned. Focusing the efforts of the public service to better facilitate the achievement of the Kenya Vision 2030. Within the tool that we have, the blueprint that I mentioned is highly praised. And in this regard, we normally have KPIs that are drawn from this planning blueprint. And once we include them for each public institution within their operations performance criteria, then they are able to implement. And this becomes the basis also of ensuring that we achieve this national blueprint. The other impact is improvement in performance and efficiency in resource utilization, and ensuring that public resources are focused on attainment of the key national policy priorities. I may not forget to mention this one. This is recruiting and the institutionalization of a performance-oriented culture in the public service, and ensuring that that culture pervades to all levels of government. So everyone knows you have a set of performance targets that you must deliver, and you may think that even at the individual level that those performance targets don't matter. They really do, because the achievement of those individual performance targets adds up to the realization of the corporate performance targets. And the totality of all those corporate performance targets is really the national performance targets that the country so deserves to achieve. As I end my presentation, let me then share with you the current reforms in performance contracting in Kenya. Our system is undergoing re-engineering, first with the automation of the processes through what we are calling Government Performance Contracting Information System. This will make the process fully web-based and online, in order to minimize the need for lengthy interpersonal interventions, thereby saving valuable management time. We are in the first phase of automating this performance contracting process. We have already done the negotiations phase. Is already built into the system, the vetting, the review, and the quarterly performance monitoring and reporting. We are now doing even the feedback of the quarterly performance reports at the comfort of our office. So an institution that is as far as 300, 400 kilometers away, I'm able to sit in my office and then go through their reports and then provide feedback and analysis of their quarterly report, again online, without even having to do the face-to-face engagements. The face-to-face engagements only comes on board when you really need to confirm that what they have reported is actually what is pertaining on the ground. Sometimes you will find the need to do exactly that for the purpose of that objectivity in that performance monitoring. The next frontier in the system that we are developing is automating the annual performance evaluation. We already have what we call an automated performance evaluation platform, but we want now to inbuild this into now this new system that we are developing. And we believe that once we achieve that module of annual performance evaluation, then we already have the whole loop of online performance contracting system in place. Now, interestingly, this system we are developing and rolling it out using local expertise. Our officers drawn from various ministries who are very vast on issues of ICT, of course, under the leadership of ourselves as technical officers. And through this, we have really saved very huge financial resources. And also, the system has endeared itself to the users. The users see it as a homegrown initiative, and therefore the ownership is very easy to achieve. Here we are talking of almost savings of almost $423,000 US dollars, because this would ordinarily have gone to cover transport, subsistence, and other incidental costs incurred by the performance contracting teams in the process of ensuring that the performance contracts for all the public institutions are in place for the financial year. As I end my presentation and engagement with you delegates, let me also mention that to reinforce and augment the gains that we have so far realized through performance management, Kenya is also developing what we are calling an integrated performance management policy. We are subjecting this to the stakeholders forum in the next 2 weeks, and we have given ourselves a target by the close of this financial year, 30th of June, we will have finalized this policy and submitted it to Cabinet for consideration. Now, the next thing that we have in mind is that once the policy is approved, it will form the basis of streamlining and standardizing public sector performance management at national level as well as county government levels. It will also form the basis. It will also form the basis of what we foresee a law or legislation on performance management, what management act that performance management in law. So, ladies and gentlemen, that is the Kenyan case that I wanted to share with you, and I thank you for your patience in listening, and I welcome any questions or clarifications before I vacate the session. Over to Prof for the next guide on this.
Thank you very much, Mr. Magwat. I mean, you couldn't just go on and on. Each time I hear, I see layers of finer points, and I think that's part of one of the key principles of teaching, that, you know, the more you listen, and that's why when we were young, we used to revise many times. The more you revise, the more you understand. And each time I listen to Mr. Magwa, I get a finer, but leave me alone. We can talk about that, because as I have already revealed, I am a big admirer of what they have done. But let us talk about the system and questions. I open this floor, and I am looking at Ms. Wilshire, and then P.S. Rudder after that. Jehu Wilshire.
Hi, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
This is very impressive. I'm deeply impressed by your presentation and by the by the implementation of the system in Kenya. I have a number of questions here, but I want to start with the one dealing with, I do not know whether I missed it, but how was the Kenya government effectively able to communicate this performance contracting system across the country amongst the various entities? Did you encounter any challenges in that regard?
Mr. Magua?
Thank you.
Yeah.
The name is Jehu Wiltshire.
Yeah.
All right. I'm having an issue, so I can't put on my video.
Thank you. Now, your question is how did the Kenya government then communicate this commitment for resource framework to the government? Is that right?
That is correct.
Very good. Now, the history, if we had time more, I think I would have given the whole history of this, but the short of it is that when the government made a commitment through the blueprint that I shared with you earlier, the economic recovery strategy for wealth and employment creation, number one, it was documented in that blueprint that all holders of public office must be placed on performance contract. So that was really the starting point. The second point was a commitment that then the government put on board, because at that time we were coming from a situation of an economy that was very battered, and therefore this was a moment that we could not afford to seize. Therefore, government under the leadership of the then president then took this initiative and made it a very clear commitment from the very, very top that this was the way to go in terms of ensuring that there is accountability in terms of performance in the government. So in a nutshell, I would then say that the mere commitment from the very top, both political and bureaucratic support, really ensured that this took place.
If I may just add to that, absolutely wonderful explanation. My own sense is, again, the role of leadership. I recall a story which is told by my friends from Kenya, that in the first early years, the President Mbaki, who was the father of this system, and we are talking about, when would this be, 2005, 6, 7, around that time. Very early days, when the results came out in the first year or second year, and they had a function where the president asked the results to be announced publicly. And so the results were being announced publicly by a common friend of ours. I think it was Richard N. Dubai or someone who was announcing these results, who was the permanent secretary in the president's office. So they announced the top 5 or 10 ministries, and they stopped. They said, these are the top. So the president looked and said, yeah, so why don't you go on? Why have you stopped? And they didn't want to go on. And guess what was the reason? The reason was, and the president made it a point. I mean, everybody was, because the gentleman who was the master of ceremonies and announcing, though senior he was not, he had no mandate to go beyond that. So he was looking at the cabinet secretary and the minister for public service. He was looking for guidance, and they kept quiet. The president said, what is the problem? And go ahead. So he just blurted out, and the problem later on they found was that the vice president was in the bottom of the list, and they didn't want to go there. So they were all so scared of going there, but the president forced them, and that's leadership. I mean, he just wanted the transparency, and I think the next day it sent a very clear signal to everyone that, look, this means serious business. And I can assure you, I know of cases at the presidential level where they chickened out, and when it came to this decision. and they chicken out. So it's again leadership. If you're serious about it, I mean, we're talking about common sense. It boils down to whether there should be a gap between your promise and delivery. This is what you promised. Nobody forced you. You wrote it down. This is what you will do. Now let's see what you have done. And so I think and so communication, they had a wonderful team. I mean, they have been blessed also with almost evangelist type of officers. I mean, I know those evangelical officers in Kenya who were like beyond the call of duty, going to every village, holding people by the collars, right, Mr. Magua? They were really Juster, Richard and Dubai. These were people who would, the great communicators, but they had the license from the president to go and communicate, and they convinced. And later on, that's one of the reasons, because many of these same officers, after retiring from the government, were also involved with helping other countries in the neighborhood. So the performance contracting has spread in all the countries that Mr. Magua mentioned. So I think communication was an important part of the success. And they have even some films on this, all sorts of audiovisual media initially. Now, of course, everybody takes it for granted. Everybody knows, the journalists and the TV people know. But initially, it was an evangelical effort on the part of a group of good officers in Kenya. I don't know, Mr. Magua, is that a fair description or not?
Prof, you have actually hit it on the head. So that's precisely the point, and the president really never hid this point from anyone. He would attend those functions of signing. He would also attend the functions of releasing the results, and the entire government. It was actually a day that the entire government was there. So if the entire government is there, then the message was strong enough. You didn't need even to tell anyone. You only needed to, and the entire government was there.
Yeah, absolutely right. I mean, it was as they say, medium was the message. The fact that the president is there, you have a function. It was more important. He has the bully pulpit. He could speak. His words matter more than hundreds of newspaper articles, and everything. And these things were covered. So government didn't have to spend much on publicity. These results were covered. Everybody was talking. And because president was taking interest, intellectuals and university, you should see, of all the countries, including United States, no country has done more, in terms of articles and research and PhD. In fact, Richard in Dubai, the officer, has finished a PhD in performance contracting. So a lot has been written because there was interest. So communication was taking place in this manner as well. I mean, this is also a way to communicate through universities and through other means. I'm sorry, but there are other questions.
Professor, if you may, I just want to ask one final question, and because this is dear to my heart. Yesterday, we noted the comments, the presentation by the former Prime Minister of Bhutan in terms of linking the performance of individual employees to the performance of the organization. In terms of Kenya, you said that beyond the fourth tier, you have appraisals done by supervisory management. Have you do you link the performance of the employees in the organizations to also the performance of the entity? Or do you have you encountered challenges in terms of those appraisals by supervisory management?
Thank you again, Mr. Jehu, for that. As you noted in one of the slides, I did say that after the third or fourth level of performance contracts, you then use simpler tools, what we call the performance appraisal. Now, the trick here is to ensure that first of all, you come up with very precise institutional performance contracts. Once that is clear, the cascading bit now becomes so simple because the individual performance appraisals now are based on the corporate performance contracts. And this is why we normally say that you cannot start with the individual performance appraisal before you have the institutional. You start with the institutional performance contract. Then you internalize, and that is why we also do a lot of capacity building. You internalize so that a supervisor is able to understand that the objective and the KPIs and the performance targets that I put or we agree with the individual employee is also addressing a KPI or an aspect of a KPI in the corporate performance contract. So that line of sight has to be ensured. Otherwise, if you do not do that, then you may find that the individual performance has really no linkage with the corporate performance. So that linkage is ensured by ensuring that both the supervisor and the employee makes reference to the KPIs agreed at the institutional, at the departmental, and therefore that cascading must have that clear line of sight.
Thank you very much, Professor, for allowing those questions. But I had a few other questions, but I will give the opportunity to other persons to ask. Thanks.
All good questions, and we'll come back if there are this time. But Ms. Rudder.
Thank you, Professor, and thanks very much indeed to Mr. Magba for such an inspirational presentation. Very, very useful to see this in action, this reported picture of it in action, both at the agency level and at the individual officers level. I can only hope that Barbados will become your first non-African continent model country to take a model from this. My query was, Jehu raised it, and it was about how to win the hearts and minds of the individual officers so that the culture, the performance-oriented culture really, how did you all do it in the beginning, rooted and grew so that today, you know, you're internationally or recently internationally award winning. But I think that was more or less addressed. So my second follow-up question was a detail, which is, what are the sanctions? You spoke of the performance incentives, monetary, but non-monetary bias on non-monetary, but you didn't speak of the sanctions. And both at the agency, apart from the name and shame, we heard about that, if there are any other sanctions besides name and shaming. Because and I'll finish with this, one of the concerns I have, and you know, my colleagues would hear me talk about it, is that here in Barbados, I am not convinced that we have really a consequence for incompetency, and any other, you know, lessons to be learned from that would be useful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simone Ruda. Let me start with the former question, the one of sanctions. As I said, you cannot have performance incentives and fail to have performance sanctions. And you are right. Some of them are the opposite of, some of the sanctions are actually the opposite of the rewards, like the one you have said, the shame, the shaming. But some of the ones that we have, and they are documented in that framework that I mentioned, if, for example, is the bonus scheme, if you don't achieve your performance targets as an individual employee, then you don't get, you are not a candidate for such a bonus scheme. So that is already a sanction enough. Now, the others are very straightforward. For example, promotions. If you are due for promotion, but for 3 successive years, your performance you have not achieved your annual agreed performance targets, then you are not a candidate of promotion. There are even other simpler ones, like what we call accelerated promotion. There are others that we call presidential honors and awards that are given at very high level by the president. So you will never become a candidate of such. So there are quite a number They had already documented in that framework that I mentioned. And since this is a public document, I may even share it with you, and then you are able to see some of those sanctions. The beauty with that framework is that the sanctions are not immediate. The first year, you are given a leeway to really improve in the second year. The second year, you are given another leeway. But from the third year, if your performance has been a rockstar in the 3 consecutive years, then the sanctions now start taking effect. Now, the first question, and I must say this is a very interesting question, because if you also don't do it right, I mean, however ambitious performance management program you may have as a government, if you don't do it right, then you really fail from the very beginning. Now, how did we win the minds of the individual officers? Very simple. We concentrated on a very, very rigorous countrywide training and capacity building for almost all the key heads of departments. That time in our country, we used to have what we were calling provinces. Now we have counties. We were having 8 provinces. So we made a deliberate decision that we must first of all hold very vigorous training programs for all the key officers countrywide. And this really, we called it a training of trainers program, because we were not able to reach, we couldn't be able to reach the thousands of public officers countrywide. So we picked the departmental heads countrywide, we trained them, and part of that training is what we also got from the training that Prof mentioned earlier, that a smaller team also attended some very high level training in Boston. So after that, we came and customized now our training to fit in within now our Kenyan perspective. And then we trained thousands of heads of departments as trainers of trainers, TOTs, who then trained those below them. So within a very short time, we were able to have a mass of public officers who had very fast changed the culture of performance, because they understood why they were being required to sign performance contracts. If you start with such a program, yet those that you are selling the program to do not even appreciate why they are doing it, then you start failing immediately. So I would say that was the first very fundamental thing that we did to win the minds of the individual officers. The second bit of it was to demonstrate results. So the very first year, the results that we were able to achieve, we really used that to broadcast to almost everyone. And that also gave now the impetus for the public officers to really buy into this program.
Thank you. I think that was extremely, Ms. Radha, that was actually, I've seen it. I told you the evangelicals, they went around training people like it's no one's business. They rolled up the sleeves. And it's also true that some of the senior most people who came to Boston, and I was part of that workshop that was organized at Boston University. It's called Boston Institute for Developing Economies. And I was a faculty there. But to see the seriousness, and they used to then meet in the evening and discuss how are we going to implement this. And lo and behold, they came back. And so it was also a group of similar thinking people who wanted to take this thing forward. And then they had these somewhat younger people who were training. So that's one of the things I think we mentioned at the beginning of this, that our hope is that everything that we have, you should have, so that the word spreads around. At least people are at the same level of. Mr. Hill, do you have a question?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
Yeah, one of the things I know, I mean, 18 days in, for the first time working in government at this level, One of the things I know is that if you change anything, there's discomfort at every level. How did Kenya address this, implementing this as a team, one? And in particular, how did Kenya deal with the union and the shop stewards as far as, is the CFR seen as additional work, a change of scope? How was that dealt with? Thanks.
Thank you, Mark. If you could go back to the first bit of the question, I didn't quite pick it up, the first bit.
Yeah, the first bit of the question is, what I find is that in government, if you move a chair, you know, it seems to have a ripple effect across the board. I'm bringing in something such as this CFR, where people are accustomed to reporting a certain way. How did Kenya deal with the change management and transitioning from one platform to the next? That's my first question. I can come up with the second one if anything.
Yeah, in other words, was there resistance to, I mean, this is a dramatic change for any country, and for Kenya also it was a dramatic change. So I think Mr. Hill is asking, was there resistance? If so, how did you deal with the resistance? That's the question.
Yeah, absolutely. Correct.
Sure. I now get it. Thank you, Mark Hill, for that. Those two questions. The first one, and you have alluded to the answer that I would have given. Obviously, such a new system in government, especially with the magnitude of the entirety of government, is bound to have some resisting. And for sure, we had that kind of resistance from various quarters. Now, number one, we didn't go full blast into the implementation. We started with some 9 months pilot scheme, and within the 9 months pilot scheme, and here we took the easier route. The easier route was to pick a set of state enterprises, because it is very easy to introduce performance management in state enterprises rather than the mainstream ministries. So we picked a few state enterprises on a pilot basis, and the results were very tremendous. And using those results, we were able to demonstrate that, look, if you do this, if we have done this in the few, there were actually 16 state enterprises. If we have done this, and these are the results, then obviously it means that we can be able to do much more with the other mainstream institutions. So that was one of the strategies that we used. The other strategy was within the capacity building that I mentioned earlier, the question that had been asked by Simon Rudna, is that within the capacity building, we also brought on board a training module on change management, where everyone was now being inculcated into a culture. And this culture was a culture of performance. So that is the second strategy that we adopted. The third strategy, of course, is what we just mentioned earlier, is that the results, communication of the results, that yes, this is what we have done so far, and these are the results. So the initial communication was so instrumental in ensuring that you manage that change management. So ideally, I would say those were the key strategies that we really adopted, and in a way, we were able to really go through the phase of change management in a nutshell, not really completely, because such an initiative, you cannot win the hearts of everybody, but on a great stride, we were able to overcome that using those strategies. The second question is very, very interesting, and I'm glad that you have asked this. This is about the unions. How did the unions take up or react to this? Now, ours was very interesting, and it had to do with, anyway, the change management that you have mentioned, because in our country we have a very strong union led by a very strong unionist. He has been there, I think, for the last 20-something years. He sits, of course, at the World Body in Geneva. And interestingly, this unionist, the first comment that came from this unionist, and I can quote here because I vividly remember, and he said that performance contracts will be introduced over my dead body. End of quote. But then because we had the blessings of government, then we said we are still going on with the program. So we took another strategy, and this was a very strategic decision. We brought on board the deputy of this unionist, who the unionist was the overall secretary general. So we brought on board his deputy on a round table, and we were able to explain about the whole concept of performance contracting. And this deputy, the parting words, when we finished the round table discussion, again he said, and I quote, that if performance contracting is about productivity, then I'm going to fully support this program. End of quote. And he went with this message to his Secretary General, and he was able to convince the Secretary General that the performance contracting is about this. And then the Secretary General was now able to win or to fully appreciate the whole concept. So in short, what I'm trying to say is that you definitely face resistance and such actions from union, because they also have to defend their stay. But the approach you use must also be very concise and very strategic, to the extent of, first of all, starting like the sensitization that I talked about earlier, and ensuring that as you sensitize the public officers, you also bring on board these very key stakeholders, such as the unions, because if you don't bring them much earlier, then they'll be beating the drums behind your back, and you can easily really fall into their beatings. So that is how we were able to maneuver through the whole issue of unions. And after that, that debate has never come on board. Actually, they are one of our great supporters of the system.
One more thing must be said, that when Mr. Magua and all the senior people came to the workshop in Boston, it was called International Workshop on Performance Contracting in Public Enterprises. It was about public enterprises. So Kenya was an amazing innovator to be one of the first countries in the developing world to really make this jump from using this technique was for public enterprises. In South Korea, it was used for public enterprises, etc. So, surely US had started using it, but this kind of using composite score, this must be noted, was a uniquely Kenyan contribution with such gusto. And at some point, because we'll all be part of the community of practice, we will get those people who convince the unionists. You have to see, to believe that how dedicated those people can be. You know, when they really believe, every part of the body just kind of spoke about. And I'm not trying to embarrass, but Mr. Magua was part of that thing also. They were just so convincing that left no choice, frankly, with anyone. They really believed in this, and that's why this. So you need some people to believe in the country to make this happen, sustain, because the Prime Minister and President cannot be talking to everyone. You need the second and third rank run people to be able to do this. I'm sorry, we'll have to just take the last two quick questions in the short, because I know I'm interfering with your lunchtime, and so this is so fascinating, one doesn't get a chance to listen to Mr. Magua. So with apologies for that, we will have a 1 hour break whenever, in a few minutes. And just last two questions, I think, Ms. Genia Oxley and then Sean Lynch, and that's it.
Thanks, Prof. Mr. Manuel, just can you elaborate a bit more on the incentives? You said that if you have to be careful because sometimes they can be meaningless. Your statement about incentives being meaningless, can you elaborate on that?
Okay, okay, okay. I think I now pick it up. Now, I mentioned this within the context of performance incentives and the sanctions. And what I meant is that if you are not very careful with the performance incentives, the whole process of incentivizing performance can become meaningless and very expensive. Why am I saying this? If you don't base your incentives or your sanctions on measurable performance, then it means that you'll be according or awarding incentives year in, year out, yet those incentives will not have any effect to the extent that employees or organizations, they then deem them as part of what they should have at the end of the year, yet possibly they are not attached to any objective performance, not just performance, but any objective performance. To that extent, therefore, the incentives will actually be meaningless and they'll become very expensive at the end of it all. And instead of spurring performance, actually the performance will be declining.
Yeah, I think just to use another way of saying that the incentives should be linked to the right thing. And if you have not, in fact, why that, as we discussed, they have not worked is because people link them to partial indicators. And in a sense, they are meaningless if you link them to a small part. In Kenya, because they had the composite score, and so they were linking to the whole organizational performance. So therefore, the linkage and the signaling was quite correct. And I think that's what he was saying, Mr. Magwa, that if you link it to something which is meaningless, then you will get meaningless results because, you'll be incentivizing something which is hard to understand. Why are you giving this money for what? Because the overall performance is not going up, but some part is, and so I think you have to be careful. And my own experience is unless you have this bottom line concept of composite score, linking to partial indicators can be risky. But Sean Lynch, please.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Mr. Lynch.
Good night where you are.
Yes.
I just want to make a comment on the midterm analysis. And I think that is a good approach that you have the midterm analysis. I think one of the challenges that we have with any of the performance systems that we use is that you only get analysis at the end. And therefore, if there are problem areas, if there are areas that need addressing, you're not aware of it until after the fact, when is probably impossible or not very profitable to make the adjustment. So I like the fact that there is a midterm analysis, and therefore you get a sense of where you are in terms of reaching and attaining your targets, and then you have the chance to make any corrective action. I'm also impressed by the fact that there is at least some type of grace period that is allowed. And finally, both incentives and sanctions. And I think that's important because a balance needs to be struck. Many times, we tend to like to look for the incentive aspect, but we don't want to look at the sanction or the accountability aspect. And I think that is important. And coming out of this exercise and the presentation by Mr. Magwa, what I see is that it will call for serious commitment if it is that we see this as a process to help Barbados move forward and improve in the management of our government. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. I take those as comments rather than questions. Is that right?
Yes, they are comments. That's correct.
Thank you.
Very good comments that I think they blended very well with this whole training program that you are undertaking. And by the end of it all, you'll be able to see how each of all those, the four that you have mentioned, how they really tie in into a standard performance management system. So those are very good observations. So I may not need to really respond because they are comments.
Thank you. Thank you. And I think Mr. Magwa can say this with confidence, because I think a month and a half or two, when we had the Africa region, we went through a similar dialogue with the rest of the African countries. And but clearly Kenya is among the best, if not the best. Rwanda and others are doing, but Kenya is arguably the leader of the gang, so to speak. I mean, they are ahead of the pack. So Mr. Magwa, it's never enough to listen to you. In my own self-interest, I love to have you, but also it's never going to be enough thanking you, because there's no way one can thank you adequately for the love and immediately that you respond, and in the interest you have served the cause for which we cannot thank you adequately, by sharing your knowledge, because this is the greatest gift one can give to anyone, to share, and so freely and so frankly. And some colleagues have asked in the chat box, and I've already promised on your behalf that, there's a lot of literature. We'll get you all the material, their guidelines, how they did it, etc., all that. So rest assured that what Mr. Magwa said, you will get all that literature. And so thank you very much, and please convey our regards and love to all the colleagues back in Kenya, Nairobi.
Thank you very much, Prof. It was wonderful sharing the Kenyan experience on behalf of the Cabinet Secretary. So I wish you well and the delegates in the remaining bit of the program. I know because of time, would not have been able to respond to some of the questions in the side chat. But if I can get them maybe later on, I can be able to respond to